I just wanted to, with the first slide, to talk a little bit about the kind of issues I heard from people. And there's a whole raft of them. A lot of it was about tired retail stock on the corridors, services that failed to meet local needs, insufficient land for residential demand, a lack of walkable, bikeable streets, and worry about being able to have your children, the people who grow up here, actually come back to live here because of the way affordability works or housing works, and a lack of employment diversity. But one of the most important things was that there was a perception of a lack of local control. I want to put some of this in perspective with talking about jobs and housing. You have an interesting situation here where you have about 30,000 employed persons who live in this area, and 27,000 of them work elsewhere. Only 3,000 of them work here. Meanwhile, there are 22,000 jobs here, and 19,000 of those jobs are held by non-residents. Well, the upshot of all of this is, so you don't have to wade through these silly slides, is that you got about 73,000 car trips a day just from that back and forth, because people don't work where they live. And most of the commuters who come here can't afford to live here because the jobs don't pay enough. So that leads to affordability and cars. Well, what do they have to do with each other? Well, if you're one of those people who's commuting in here, AAA says cars cost around $8,900 a year. Now, if you lose that car, you say, okay, I'm gonna live near where I work and not use that car. It's equivalent to about a $500 or $600 subsidy. If you have a two-car household that decides they're going to move here, they could be living right now somewhere on the other side of town in an $800 rental, and by losing the cars and coming here and deciding to walk to work without the cars, they have the equivalent ability to pay an $1,800 rent without changing their disposable income. That means they still have the same income to go out to restaurants, to go to entertainment, to buy clothing, to buy food, just because they don't use a car. So when we're talking about workforce housing, it means that we have some potential here if we can begin to think about how to create development where you don't need to own a car. And that brings up the question of mixed use. Mixed use right now in this economy is very difficult because it's hard to pay for the rents for mixed use for commercial. A standard commercial retail rent here is about $28. A retail rent for the restaurants and bars that are close to the ocean is over 40. Some of them are over 60. I heard one quote of around 100 a square foot. In mixed use, because it's a new building, you can't have a rent as low as 28, which is what a normal retailer might be able to afford here. So the solution is to think about mixed use as being incremental, that you don't always demand the retail immediately. Where you really want the retail, you make sure that the building has the right floor type for it, but you allow them to fill that floor type. You know, this would have worked over on Turquoise, where there are empty shop fronts underneath condos. If they had been allowed, instead of having to lease to retail, to lease to whoever they could lease it to until such time as the retail market improved, those shop fronts would be full, and the people who look at those projects and say, well, I don't want to be put in that position, wouldn't be worried anymore. So this is current values per square foot. You can see, obviously, the red shows it's more valuable at the ocean. We knew that. But there's also scattered red in there that shows that there's a possibility of capturing value in those interior areas. Now, the orange blobs there are owners who do not live in San Diego. I want you to note that it's clustered along the coast, and it's clustered right around that Garnet Grand corridor. Look at this one, land use versus ownership. It's the same thing. What you have is that your commercial areas and your multifamily areas are largely owned by people who aren't from here, and that may explain some of the perception that you have of feeling like you have a lack of control. And there's the overlay where you see the orange areas covering that same area of apartments and commercial. Well, what's the point of showing you that? It's that in thinking about this and thinking about that feeling of, it's time to give you some tools to feel like you have some local control with this stuff. So we have some recommendations here to try and meet the needs that we heard and also to deal with those issues. So create walkable, bikeable networks, concentrate retail and commercial. This is critical. When you have wide areas of zoning, what you do is you dilute the market for the zoned product. Now, in the case of housing, you want that market diluted so that people can afford it. You don't want to have housing concentrated and such that the demand can't be met and the price rises. But in the case of commercial and retail, it's exactly opposite. You want to create destinations. Consider putting liquor licensing and location under local land use controls. Right now, it's just run by the ABC. And so instead of being concentrated in an entertainment district where it could be well patrolled and controlled and be a real asset to your community, it's spread out all over the place. Consider adding land use oversight to some other categories that for the location of controversial land uses, and make your corridors, such as Garnet and Turquoise and Carr, make them transit ready. They don't have transit now, but give them the kind of density and intensity that will make sense when the transit planners 10 years from now look at those. They'll say, oh, those people ought to have transit because it will be well served. We're also talking about modifying the area zoning. You need to increase the density of your multifamily residential in specific areas. You need to implement mixed use incrementally, not trying to do it all at once. It's not an all or nothing thing. You need to give developers some slack about how to implement mixed use so that they don't lose money when they're trying to do it, and it will incentivize their ability to do it. You need to, and this is probably controversial, enable no-car projects. What I mean by that is projects that don't have any parking, where the people who move into them don't have any cars. Now, that sounds insane, but that example that I gave of having a $1,000 a month rent subsidy for a two-car family means that what are they trading for? They're trading a horrible commute for living in a place where they can walk to the grocery store and they can walk to work and they can walk to the beach and live in one of the most beautiful places in the state of California. And finally, my urban framework is going to appear with Steve Cecil. But we're talking about having walk sheds with an altered zoning pattern and better pedestrian facilities. We want an urban framework that creates a pedestrian network for the neighborhoods that connects Garnet and Turquoise via a greenway at Cass, that concentrates retail and commercial destinations and enables value capture through changing the zoning. And what do I mean by that? It increases the corridor residential density. So if you imagine a walking radius around Garnet, we're talking about in an area like that, that's where you want to increase density. Right now, for at least 10 years, people have been building multifamily that is not giant. It's just 3 stories. It's like what you have that is actually 35 units an acre. So we're talking about potentially almost tripling the density. And what does that do for you? It increases the market for neighborhood services so that it makes more sense for retailers who want to give you the services that you feel that you're lacking. It makes more sense for them to come here and do it. And that means that it starts a virtuous cycle for change. So we're talking about what we call a market demand zone. We're not talking about downzoning. What we're saying is on these commercial corridors, we might, by putting the commercial zoning in one place, have zoning left over, and I was calculating on Garnett, it could be as much as 30 acres left over that could go to residential or mixed-use residential. Creative reuse of structures if possible. And this will enable immediate opportunities, but you need a community plan to target these areas. You know, I'm talking in kind of generalities and I crunch numbers, but this is something that you all have to decide on, where you want these things to happen and how you want them to happen and at what intensity you want them to happen. It would replace the current arterial commercial zone. So it needs market flexibility. That is, people really need to be able to respond to the market instead of being told that they have to have a certain type of retail frontage. There would be no minimum parking requirement because you also are at some point going to have to provide district solutions for parking. It's just like storm drainage. You don't expect everybody to take storm drainage, care of that on their own site. Parking is the same. It's like a storm that comes and goes. In summer it's a flood, and right now, not so bad. And retail is only required where you have a destination cluster. And we're talking about a fairly high residential density. So you want standalone retail, if you're going to have it, in clustered destinations, not spread out over the landscape like peanut butter. Retail in mixed use would be allowed on Garnett and Turquoise anywhere. Second floor residential, third floor residential would be allowed anywhere. And the form for retail would be required where it's felt by the community to be necessary, where you identify that in the future you want a retail cluster or node. But the retail use itself is not required until the market will bear it or support it. The advantages of this is it responds to the market now, and basically it captures maximum value for low-value sites, and there are some low-value sites here. I think there's a strip mall at Haynes and Garnett, which I could imagine could be that kind of redevelopment. And it provides options for profit for existing owners who may now have very little incentive with the current regulations. And it begins a process of change. Aside from the difficulty of making a plan, it's really at no public cost. We're not saying you have to build new things to do it. The real idea here is that all of this is subject to a community plan to target how you're going to do this and where you're going to do it. And the same thing with you have a current single-family multi-unit zone. That means that it's single-family, but it's in multi-units. And right now, the density of that is very low, and it's quite possible using small lot housing or courtyard housing to bring that density up to 20 units an acre. And again, this is subject to the community having some control about where and how this stuff happens to enable these things to take place. Funding, there are grants and donations, obviously. There's CDBG, Community Development Block Grant funding from HUD. EPA has smart growth, water, brownfields funding. And as a matter of fact, for innovative stormwater funding, they will help build projects. Department of Transportation has various grants associated with funding, and that's all generic. But here you can also use some tax credits. You have the ability, at least in a few significant areas along Garnett, to use new market tax credits. And as Tom said, that will help subsidize a good chunk of the cost and enable you to help create new living and employment space. There are job creation grants that come through community development block grants that will allow you to have a $50,000 grant that is a loan per employee for jobs created. If you're taking a structure and renovating it and putting in new jobs, and if you keep those people there for 5 years, that $50,000 loan turns into a grant. So if you hire 10 people, you can get $500,000 in loans, and in 5 years, it turns into a grant. So that's quite powerful. In other cities, they have instituted facade improvement programs, and that would be very helpful here. In Portland, we have that program, and we do it not by just giving the money to the property owners. We have a designer that they have to use, which means that they get much better facades, and you're not looking at somebody's idea of screaming large yellow signs or something else. And it means that the design is under the control of the community again. Public development corporations. You kind of don't have one anymore. Although you do have Civic San Diego, you used to have a public development corporation, but they can be very useful because they're quasi-public, and in other places they're used to coordinate things like community development funding institutions with public-private partnerships with private development. CDFIs and CDCs, a CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution, is the vehicle through which you receive new market tax credits, but it can also have, as part of its makeup, a consortium of banks who use it to funnel their Community Reinvestment Act money. And that becomes very powerful because banks don't like loaning on real estate. For every dollar they lose, they have to do $160 of clean business. So they really don't like lending on real estate. They like houses fine because they're guaranteed by somebody else. But when they're doing their CRA, that money doesn't go by the loan committee. It's not posted on the books as a loan. It's not subject to their loss rules. And if you get 5 banks together and you get them each to put another, $5 million in the fund, then you're talking about a $25 million starter fund to add to this and work on this public-private partnership to get some change happening here.